Finding Foundations is a series where, we're going to cover a lot of ground, especially for those of you that have been believers for a while. You're going to come back and say, Pete, I've heard this before. I've been a believer for 30 years. It seems like we're covering old ground. But by the same token, we still want to come back to a lot of the roots of our faith and really lay the foundations correctly, right? Build it up from the ground up for a couple of reasons. One is we'll have this beautiful recorded video where if you ever have somebody that you're bringing into church and you need to catch them up on, say, hey, this is what we believe in. You're like, sit in front of this monitor for about 10 hours and watch these YouTube clips and run them through it. But I also, saints, I want to equip you as well in the conversations that you're going to have. Parents, you need to understand this to explain it properly to your kids. I can't say enough when the discussions are going on in the pastor's room and elder room. You can confirm, Pastor Igor, where we're seeing that young people, as they're going into baptism class, are knowing less and less about Scripture. And it's not because, maybe they're reading less, maybe they haven't gotten the same education, but I also feel like maybe the parents aren't teaching as much, and maybe that's because the parents don't understand all the intricacies either. So, again, not to bag on parents, young people, you need to be listening to this and taking it internally, but all of that is to say that all of us, no matter what age group we are in here today, we need to understand these concepts, and that's why I encourage you, take these notes, write them down, make sure you grab the video afterwards, and be very comfortable explaining this to those around you, whether that be your kids, your peers, people at work, people at school, wherever that might be. I had a young lady come up to me recently, and she confessed, said, Pete, I'm having a tough time praying. And there's so many reasons why that could happen. So as we begin to have this discussion, invariably, it comes back to what I hear with so many young people today. And it's a question of, do I really believe in a God? Like, what really is the foundation of my faith that there is a God? Living in a society that's becoming more secular every single day. And again, this is... I hear it constantly, again, from young people. I don't hear it from older folks. Maybe it's because you've kind of decided, listen, I'm stuck in it now. I've been doing it for 30 years, 40 years. I might as well keep going. But I hear that question all the time. And parents, you might be hearing it from your kids, because I know I asked my dad these same questions as I was going through college, and I was saying, well, how can you believe? How do you know? And it seems so basic, yet when we don't answer those questions satisfactorily in the right way, the kids say, okay, you really don't know either. And they're left with the impression that there is not an answer. They're left with the impression that the answer you gave, or they hear elsewhere, is inferior to what Charles Dawkins is going to tell them, or some other atheist is going to tell them. Because they're going to hear that on YouTube all day long. And so, folks, again, I want to come back to finding our foundations in understanding and how we go about proving the existence of God and explaining the worldviews around God. The Bible begins with a very bold statement. Honestly, if you begin and you open it up to Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning, God." And thereby creating one of the most controversial statements ever. In the beginning, God. It doesn't start with any proof statements about God. Let me tell you why there could be a God. It just makes a statement and leaves you hanging there. In the beginning, God. And thereby lies the beginning of our faith. And thereby lies the question that humanity will always ask themselves. Did God make man, or did man make God? Did God make everything, or did we just come up with a notion of a God? What I want to share with you today to begin with is 5 worldviews on God. 5 worldviews on this being that we know as God, but what do people believe in this world? And we'll highlight those briefly, just so that we understand what we're dealing with in humanity in general. And so the 5 major worldviews on God today are such There are, first of all, naturalists. These are going to be the atheists or the agnostics. They're mentioned in the Bible only once, Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds, there is none who does good. There is no God, the fool says in his heart in Psalm 14. Folks that subscribe to naturalism, the atheists, the agnostics, will say there is obviously no God, but there is also no soul, no spirit. Man is a product of evolution. We're just atoms clumped together forming cells, which are clumped together forming us. Our soul is just neurons firing in our mind. Nothing more to that, nothing less. We will be wiped out one day. We came through as an accident, and some accident will wipe us out. Values and morality are subjective. Morals are individual preferences. You choose what is good and bad, or we as a society choose what is good and bad. Today, this is great. Tomorrow, we decide, you know what, that same action, we're not going to tolerate that anymore, and we just kind of generally decide what is good and what is bad. I want to make a statement here, folks. When we take values out of life, life loses its value. People that believe in naturalism will, when you press them, when you take their thoughts to their natural end, will say that life has little to no value. Life has little to no value. There is no soul, that we're just atoms. We might be conscious, but overall, in an individual, life has little to no value. That is why you can kill unborn babies and not be worried about it. You know, that's a big debate right now in the news. And I hear all these arguments. Well, what if she was raped? And what if you know, she's a child pregnancy? And we can talk about those situations. But 93% of all abortions happen just because she doesn't want the baby, not because of some calamity or she's in danger of her health. 93% of women that have an abortion is because I don't want the social stigma. I'm not ready to take care of it. Whatever. Just get rid of it. Atheism was once considered so destructive because of this, that there's a reason it's not mentioned in the Bible more. Ancient societies would ostracize people that said there was no God because they believed, listen, if you don't believe in a God, if you don't believe in at least something greater than you, if there is not a value system you place in your life through that, then you are somebody who perhaps lives without value. You don't value yourself or others because of that, because you think everything's finite, you're going to die, and therefore, what kind of an individual are you then that you don't believe in something greater, that you're part of something greater? And so it was seen as very destructive even back then because of these things. Life has little to no meaning eternally or now, just no meaning to it. I go online every once in a while and you see all these forums, and kids today online are joking about suicide. And it's a joke until it comes to fruition, until it happens. More than ever before, and I grew up as a kid, and I've never heard, like, somebody would joke about suicide, and you would think they're weird or strange, and now it's commonplace. People are saying, well, so what? It's a win-win if I die, because times are tough, I have to finish college, I've got college debt, might as well just end it all. Suicide rates are increasing in atheistic countries, or countries that are becoming more atheistic. There's a correlation there. People that believe in naturalism, the natural end of this worldview is despair, chaos, and despair. There is no value, there is no meaning. Eventually, when you come to terms with what you really believe in, when you're a naturalist, atheist, agnostic, there is no purpose in life. Might as well end it all. Suicide is a very natural way out of that, a very logical way out of that. Because if you're living just to make your brain happy, and if your brain's not happy, might as well just shut it down. I think that's why, honestly, today, you see such a big movement to legalize drugs in a lot of Western nations. Because, and you look at other things that really shut down your brain, right? All these music festivals are so popular because young people today are losing sight of what does my life mean. And so what I've got to do is I've got to drink, I've got to, smoke weed, I've got to, go out to these concerts and just drown it all out with music and have a good time and be on social media and be entertained constantly and drown out the fact that I believe that life is meaningless. And just constantly, get my brain to generate dopamine because that's the only meaning of life. They don't teach that in schools, obviously. How depressing the conclusion of that is. Pastor Mark Driscoll said once, "Have you ever wondered why atheists don't have songs?" It's pretty depressing to sing about suicide or having no meaning. Naturalism becoming more common. Theism is another worldview that we see. This is more traditional Polytheism, ancient religions from Africa, Greco-Roman, Maya, Aztec, Egyptian, Babylon, Native Americans here, all over the place. In some way, Hinduism, some forms of Hinduism is still a theistic or a polytheistic worldview. Folks that believe in this believe that the world is populated by spirits, by gods with a lowercase g, who govern what goes on. Gods and demons are the real reason behind natural events and often attached to physical objects, aka this is the spirit of the pulpit, the spirit of my spear, the spirit of corn, of weather, of my car. It's not happy, my tire pops, my transmission blows. They attach spirits to physical things. Man is a creation of the gods like the rest of the world in this worldview, and we're manipulated by the gods often to their own means and desires. So the gods, all of these spirits have their own desires. You're a puppet, and if they're feeling great, you're feeling great. But you have to keep sacrificing. You have to keep pleasing all of these little deities. Man, you go back into the Old Testament and you see the people of Israel sliding to the point where they're doing children's sacrifices. I mean, how desperate do you have to be to sacrifice your own kids alive into the fire to please these little gods that you think are all around you? I've got a small knife at home sent to me from a missionary who was down in Southern America. It's about this big, made out of green stone, looks very beautiful, very polished. The story behind it is that this is a replica of a knife that was used for human sacrifices. On one side, it's got a grotesque face carved into it. It's a small stone, other than that, very sharp, and they would just slit the throats of hundreds and thousands of prisoners on those, Aztec pyramids, in sacrifice to their gods. And obviously today, you're not going to see that. I mean, not the human sacrifice or even animals, but you'll go into some restaurants and you guys will see these little Taoist, I don't know if it's a Buddha or some little idol, and they'll put like little cakes and things. And I actually spent way too much time researching this. There's different kinds of foods. Like if you want to please them, you put foods that give off a scent. But if you want to get something from them, you have to put rice because rice soaks stuff in. And there's a whole ritual around all of this stuff. And it's, again, controlled. I want my restaurant to be great, so I'm going to put this today. And there's a whole religion around this. If you want them to be good. If they're angry with you, then your life is miserable. Remember Elijah to the prophets of Baal? And he's laughing at them and saying, surely he says, perhaps your God is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. And he's laughing at these men that are at this point cutting themselves in sacrifice to their own God. They are so desperate, so controlled by these imaginary deities and spirits that they believe are all around them. People that believe in some form of theism believe that moral values are more so taboos. So don't do things because they'll irritate the gods. Don't do things because they'll irritate these little spirits that are around us. The ultimate form, the ultimate end of theism is fear. Living a life in perpetual fear. 2 Kings 17:30, the people of Israel are told, listen, when you turn to God, you will not have to fear other gods. You don't have to live in a place of fear. Man, you look at Solomon towards the end of his life, and he's living surrounded by all these wives and concubines, and then all of them telling, listen, we're afraid of our God, and what about our God? And he's walking around setting up all of these little altars and temples to all of these gods, living in a place of fear. Acts 17:22, Paul goes into Athens. You guys remember this story. He goes into Athens and sees these temples, and they're beautiful, folks. We went to Israel, and they've got a couple of Roman cities there that are still there, because Rome, when they occupied, they built their own cities up. Beautiful temples, well designed. I mean, we're talking about buildings. You stand there, and they're maybe higher than this church building, massive columns, all of just multiple temples upon temples. And then he says, listen, I even found there's some altar you guys put up for the unknown gods. Like, you're worshiping everything, and then you're like, just in case we missed you, we're going to put this one there. How afraid do you have to be of all these little gods? That's why they almost wanted you to worship. That's why Romans hated atheism, because they're like, listen, do us all a favor. Worship some little deity in case that little deity is going to get angry that nobody worships him. And so theism is about living in fear. Pantheism. This is going to be a lot of Buddhism, a lot of the Sikh religion, New Age, Hinduism. This is a belief that only the spiritual exists. Everything is a part of a God spirit. He's a part of everything. God is not really an individual. This is important. He's not a being that you really interact with one-on-one. He's more of an all-encompassing life force, if you will. And the summation of the universe is all a part of this God. We're a part of this reality. He's internal, he's impersonal, he's out there somewhere, a part of everything, but you're here by yourself and he's out there. Really no difference between good and evil other than you just want to be positive. Folks, this is what Christianity becomes when we lose our principles, when we lose that personal interaction with God, a form of deism. If you hear Oprah Winfrey and it's about positivity and your faith into general spiritual being, into something that's out there, this is what America really lives in today, if you will. A general understanding of the Jesus, not Jesus, the Jesus and the Buddha and all these, and it's all a part of everything leads to one truth. I work with a young lady who, incredible individual, very smart. She is literally the most positive person I know. Like, she'll turn anything and she'll make it positive. Just a beautiful being. But I mean, she speaks about, hey, I grew up in a Christian home, things happened, and now she's in a place where she's like, well, everything's happening, it's all one, just let's be positive, and the mutation of all of these different religions and belief and chakras and positive energy points, and you see how lost she is when things happen. Going through some tough times, and you see there's a sense of despair there too, because, well, what do you believe in? When you challenge some of those beliefs, there's really not answers there. There's more questions than answers. And so folks that believe in this pantheism, when you come up against evil, when you hear about rape, when you hear about cancer, when you hear about just stuff happens to you, and you can't do anything about it, there is no God that is nearby. There's nobody to lean on. You live in a state of hopelessness and powerlessness. You guys know people like that? Yeah, they're generally kind of believe in spiritual things, but when tough times happen, there's really nothing there for them to lean on. And folks, Christianity, some of you are you might be sitting here and thinking, I'm kind of trending that way. When you don't have that personal relationship with Jesus Christ, he becomes impersonal. You might as well be a pantheism, a form of believing in a form of pantheism. Yeah, there is a God, but he's so far, and I don't feel him nearby. And when you get into tough times, it's tough. The outcome here is these three things. One is there's no originator of our universe. If God is part of everything and he's part of the universe, well, then he can't start the universe if he's a part of it. Two is there's no way to have a relationship with that type of God. There is no God of John 3:16 when you believe in some form of this. There is not a God who loved you so much that he would send his firstborn, his only born son to die for you, to save you, when you believe in some form of pantheism. He's just a God out there doing his own thing, and you have to take care of yourself. And third of all, there's no moral standard. When things happen, when rape, murder, civil injustice happens, you're kind of left by yourself, clutching your pearls, saying, "How could you?" And having no moral foundation to stand on. Monotheism. This is Judaism, Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses. We could name some more that we know. It's a belief that there is a God. God exists. He's infinite. He's powerful. He's wise. He created the world. He created us. And because he's perfect, he's created a set of perfect laws. He calls us to a higher standard. He says, "Be holy as I am holy." And he holds us to that standard. He wants perfection in the universe. And we, as part of the universe, must hold ourselves up to that standard. But in that scenario, God becomes a judge. You have to keep the law. Maybe if you're a Muslim, you got to pray 5 times a day. If you're Jewish, you've got to live the perfect life, and you've got to follow this. Literally an encyclopedia set of laws that have been, just built up on over the years. You got to follow them all and wash your hands the right way and do everything. On Sunday, you can't leave your neighborhood. It's just law after law after law after law. And as you fail, you try harder. And you try harder and you still fail, and you can't be perfect. And so what this leads to eventually is one of two things. On one side, it can lead to pride, hypocrisy, self-righteousness. Pastor Mark Driscoll says it leads to the wearing of funny hats. It leads to a religion where, well, I'm more righteous than you, so my hat is bigger than yours. Or I've got a smaller hat. Or I've got to wear this suit because I've got this rank and you wear a little suit. And you're not as holy as me. And I'm better. It leads to a lot of rules. And there's an attraction here, honestly, folks. You see folks, even in the Western United States, when this whole ISIS thing was happening, and folks in the U.S. would be like, "Hey, I'm converting," and you see this like white guy out there fighting, and you're thinking like, well, what caused him to switch, to convert to a very violent form of that religion? And when there is structure, when somebody can buy into that and say, "Listen, I'm a disciplined individual. I like what I see here. I can have salvation by discipline." And people can buy into that and getting some sort of a peace saying, "Well, now I finally have control over my salvation. If I keep trying, if I'm disciplined, then I can possibly be, quote unquote, saved." That's one side of it, this pride, this hypocrisy, the self-righteousness. The other side is exhaustion. And I think so many believers live in that today, especially those that, you really do love the Lord. You really do. And you want to keep his commandments. And so you try hard. And you read Scripture and you commit to it and you do what's there. But you live also in a state where you feel like God is judging you. God, what did I do wrong that I failed this test? God, what did I do wrong that I got into this car wreck? I got a speeding ticket. You're punishing me again, God. And maybe you're feeling like this man that's like, God, fine, I'll take it. Keep punishing me. I deserve it. And almost trying to gain righteousness through punishment in a way. And we feel like, again, God is there. You don't come to God for mercy. You want to run from him because he keeps punishing and judging you and telling you again how sinful you are. And when you finally feel like you've made it and you're not that sinful anymore, you've just turned into a prideful hypocrite. And so either you're exhausted or you're a prideful hypocrite. Martin Luther talks about his testimony. He, growing up in the Catholic faith at that time, being a Catholic priest, and especially this was the late 1400s, 1496, right around when Columbus discovered the Bahamas. He was a young man then, and he said, I saw this figure. He says, a prince named William of Anhalt walking the streets of Magdeburg, Germany, emancipated, starving, begging, carrying a sack on his back like a donkey. He had so worn himself down by fasting and vigil that he looked like a death's head, mere bone and skin. He thought he could gain salvation through his own suffering, self-denial, and purgation. And then Martin Luther, being a devout man, says, man, I want to devote my life to serving the Lord, becomes a priest, and goes through the exact same thing. And he says, as I'm teaching Scripture, as I'm reading it, I go into Romans 1:17, where Paul talks about the righteousness of God, and he said, I hated those words. Because to me, when I read the righteousness of God, to me, that meant that God was punishing me with his righteousness. Think about it. It's so unfair. God, you would put me on this earth to suffer already. I got to pay taxes. I get sick. People hate me. My car breaks down. My wife is complaining. My husband's complaining. My husband doesn't want to do anything. He's too late. I'm suffering already. And then on top of that, you come in, and every time I pick up Scripture, you remind me, guess what? You're not perfect, and I'm going to punish you again for how imperfect you are. And he says, I begin to hate the book of Romans, and I begin to hate the words that God is righteous. Living in a state of just exhaustion. Not of loving God, but almost hating him. And he would say the same thing. I came to hate God in a way because of being in that impossible position. How do you become righteous like God? How do you become perfect? Which leads us to true Christianity. We believe that we are created by a perfect, holy God, infinitely intelligent, infinitely powerful. He creates us, puts us in this world. Humanity falls, sins, we are far from perfect. And so God, being perfect and just, in his judgment, will wipe out this sin, this imperfection. But he waits. He waits, and he allows humanity to come back and repent of that. And knowing that humanity, giving us the law, and knowing that humanity cannot do it by himself, in his great love, he takes a part of himself, Jesus Christ, and he will send it to earth. He will appear on earth in Christ to die, to receive the full punishment that humanity must receive for the life that we live. Knowing that we will become exhausted and at best become prideful hypocrites, he sends his Son to serve our time, if you will, to pay our fine. He doesn't just forgive the fine, and I think that's so important for us to just remember again. He doesn't just, hey, don't worry, I'll forgive you. And some Judaism, for example, will say, listen, he understands I can't be perfect, so he'll just forgive me. Well, how would a God be just if a criminal came into his court and he said, hey, listen, I know you murdered his parents, but listen, I just forgive you. And you would say, that is not justice. Somebody had to pay the price. And Christ pays that price for us. Which leaves us in a place of love and hope. Which leaves us in a place when we read the righteousness of God. We can continue to read that verse and see that it says that the righteous shall be saved by faith. It leaves us in a place of joy, knowing that we have, through our faith, we have access to God again through Jesus Christ. And I think that's why so many today, you hear all these stories in Muslim nations, folks coming to the Lord when Christ appears to them in visions and other ways and speaks the truth, and they realize that I've been working so hard. How tough is it when you put your ladder up against the side of a building and climb it your whole life, and when you reach the top of it, you realize, I put it up against the wrong building. But yet, the Lord's coming in and saving people today and saying it's not about the work you do. And it's not about pantheism. It's not like I'm just here sitting back letting you suffer and just positive thoughts. He says, I am a personal God. I am with you. There is a God in being that chose to interact with humanity in a very, very personal way, created us specifically for that relationship, and calls each one of us to live it every single day. That is what we believe. The second part of this that we want to speak to is, how can I know that, Pete? What you're telling me makes sense. I love it. I want to live this. But how can I know it? We live in a very logical society, and I want to speak to that as well, because the God we worship is not a small God. You can't just put some rice in front of an idol and think, the God that created the universe, millions of light years, 200 pieces of rice should do the trick for him. There was an old story / joke about a fisherman sitting on the dock catching fish. And as he pulls them out, he's doing very well. He's having a great morning. And as he pulls them out, he kind of measures them and throws all the big ones away. So one of his buddies comes up to him and he's like, listen, what are you doing? There's not a limit. You realize that there's not a limit on how big of a fish you can catch. In fact, why don't you keep the big ones, and then you'll need fewer of them to feed yourself, and throw the little ones back? And the old fisherman turns to the young guy and says, you don't understand, man. My frying pan is only 8 inches across. I need the small fish to fit in my frying pan. Throw the big ones back. We live in an age, or maybe I can say this better, we as humans, when something doesn't fit into the frying pan, the 6 or 8 inches between these two ears, when it doesn't fit in this frying pan, we say, chuck it out. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And when we talk about a God that, as science progresses more and more, and we realize just how vast the universe is and how incredible molecular biology is, and as we understand more about how incredible that is, people begin to chuck out the notion of God, saying, too big. It answers too much too easily. Throw it out. And yet, we live and serve a God that is so big that it'll take ages and ages and ages of human research, and we still won't figure out the start of him. Man, Hebrews 11:1, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. God is going to be bigger than your understanding. That is the way it was designed and made. He didn't give you the mental capacity. Humanity will not achieve an understanding of God, where you can put down proof texts and say, here's the algorithm of God. Here's the molecule of God, even though I believe there is a God particle of some sort that they've named, which has nothing to do with him. It's completely part of this material world. There is something bigger than this material world. And so when Jesus was asked who will be in heaven, he put forth a child and said, listen, you can't understand, and so be like this child. When you explain molecular biology to him, he says, sure, I believe you. That's how it works then. You tell me. He says, if you can't be like that and say, put the whale on my frying pan, it's not going to fit, but I believe it. Let me accept that. Let me accept that relationship and enter into it. I love the story of Job. And he spends chapters upon chapters questioning God and saying, give it to me, God. Give it to me straight. Shoot me straight. Let me know the real reason why all of this is happening. Let me know who you are. And God says, oh, fine, I'll give you a little hint. You know, Moses wanted to see God. Job wanted to hear from God. He says, I'll tell you. And he begins to just address things that were impossible to know in their time. In our time, he would say, do you know what makes up dark matter? Do you know what the edge of the universe looks like, Pete? Do you know what happens? I mean, like we're taking these beautiful pictures of dark holes that just happened like a month or two ago. Do you know what a dark hole looks like or a black hole looks like? Do you know? And as he begins to ask us these questions, and we would be, I don't even know the words that you're using, God. What's that word? He says, oh, you'll discover it in about 200 years, don't worry. Do you know? And when we realize that that's the kind of God we serve, it just makes it so. There's a guy that came up to me. I was preaching at another church, and he came up and stopped me afterwards. He says, no, what do you mean? You know, stars are light years away. They're right there. I'm telling you, they're like, you know, it's a flat earth and a dome and everything. And I'm like, listen, man, I don't want to insult you. I'm not here to argue about, like, you know, that's not why I come around and teach. But I'll tell you my personal belief is I love science. I really do. And I love when they go out into space and find out more stuff. And I love when they find out more about our DNA and microbiology. You know why? Because it just makes my God bigger. I don't have to constrain him to a flat earth and a dome. He's bigger than that. It's just every time they find out something new, I'm like, that's amazing. He's even bigger than I thought. And so, if I could, I'm going to share 7 brief arguments for God's existence that you can make a note of, share. Things that when I share with non-believers, with friends that I have, and they say, well, Pete, what makes you believe that God exists? Is there one thing? And I'm going to say, maybe it's not one thing, but I've got data points in my mind. I've got things that when I start to line them up, there's so many of them that they start to show a pattern that indicates to me and points to me at something that is there. There is still faith involved there, but I'm seeing a trend here. I'm seeing a pattern that is indisputable. And so I'll share a couple of these with you. The first one is this, just the concept of God. Romans 2:18-22 talks about this. I won't read for the sake of time, but it talks about the fact that we, all of us, individuals, have this idea, this concept from age to age, from generation to generation, tribes that have yet to be discovered, all have come to an idea of there being a God being. With literally just a tiny exception, almost everybody understands and believes there is probably some sort of a God. Somebody said that there was a God-shaped vacuum in the human heart, in every human heart. The second piece of data that I would look at is the origin of matter. I'm actually going to quote and read from a publication called The New Scientist. For a long time, scientists held that the universe was eternal and unchanging. This allowed them to avoid the God question, who or what caused the universe, because they reasoned that a beginningless universe needed no cause. They recognized that if the universe began to exist in a finite past, that it begged for a cause that was outside of the time-space continuum. As Stephen Hawking told his well-wishers in a pre-recorded message, a point of creation would be a place where science broke down. One would have to appeal to religion and the hand of God. Three scientists, led by a gentleman named Alexander Vilenkin, recently concluded and brought out, I don't know if it was a thesis or data or the way they approached it, but he's saying we've concluded in that situation with a starting point that all evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning, and scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe and must face the problem of a definite beginning. And they came to disprove multiple theories about how maybe it was a rebound or there are multiverses or other beginnings. There's a series of like 7 or 8 different theories about multiple universes in the past, and he says, listen, the data does not support that, or what we're seeing here does not support that. We really believe that the universe had a beginning, and if it had a beginning, there must be something that began it. 3, the evidence of intelligence. I'm not going to go into examples of how beautifully and wonderfully we're made. Greg read a lot of that this morning in the passage. But I want to quote Albert Einstein, and he's quoted as saying, as he delves into the realm of physics and sees the order of laws as they come together, simple phrases like E equals MC squared. I literally in high school read a book about this thick about it, and I still have no clue what it means. But yet something simple like that describes so much. And he says, I walk into this creation as if I'm in a library, and I look around and I see how ordered everything is and how it just all flows and makes sense, and it's put together in such an intelligent fashion that it makes me come to the conclusion that there is intelligence behind it. Somebody put it together that way. There is a super intelligence that had acted upon this. It is not chaos. 4th, the uniqueness of humans. We can speak to our moral conscience. We can speak to many other parts of how we were created in a way that just rises infinitely above the rest of creation, in a way that indicates that we are a special being created for a purpose. 5th, Scripture and its prophecies. This is a big one for me personally. And I know we've spoken about it, I think maybe 3 or 4 Sundays ago. For example, when you start to go in, I think, was it Isaiah that just outlined perfectly the rise of Alexander the Great and how he would conquer that known world and then be split up into 4 nations that would then come together into 2. And it's just laid it out, and 200 or 300 years later it just happens. You know, the prophecies of Jesus and how all of that happens. And you start to look at what's happening here, and you realize this is unnatural. There must be something greater. Speaking of Jesus, the evidence of Jesus as a deity, I shared this, I believe, at the Russian service, but there was a panel on the resurrection of Christ that was done, I believe, late 80s. 5 philosophy heads of their departments on the East Coast, Ivy League. One of them actually was from James Madison, where I'm an alum. And they brought in two doctors, if you will, one who was battling for and speaking for the resurrection of Christ, and one who was going to refute it. And after about a 2-day debate, these atheist men, agnostic perhaps, came to the conclusion, 4 out of 5 of them said that the evidence is strong enough to suggest that the resurrection happened. One of them said, I need to look into this myself now. This is really startling. And the fourth one said, well, I'm kind of on the fence. This is really new to me, and I don't want to make a decision right now, but I need to investigate this further. You begin to think about how all of that lines up. And the story of Christ is evidence again that there is a God, and a very personal God, that would come in the form of Christ. And the last one I'll mention here is answered prayers, miracles, testimonies. Without going into detail here again, I think so many believers, I did a course for our baptized folks about witnessing. And as I kind of studied the subject, the biggest part of witnessing, I feel, what you can share with others that is just so simple yet so profound, is your personal testimony and your experience with God. And when you're talking to others, whether they be people that know about God somewhat or not at all, one of the best questions to ask is, man, have you ever experienced God in your life? Or it felt like there was something greater in your life? And let people begin to speak. You'll be surprised. Man, you'll be surprised where folks that are really not religious or really questioning, but they begin to tell you stories about this happened and that. Man, you see so much of that. And obviously even more in the life of believers. And folks, I know, who here keeps track of answered prayers? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. I'd love to see more, guys. I've got a little Word doc that I'm just writing it in like, man, I call it, I've seen the Lord. Where have I seen God in my life just do miraculous things? You just go back to that and you begin to kind of scroll and read, and you're like, this is incredible. There is somebody that really loves me, really pursues me. We forget about all the times God's come into our life and just done miraculous things and answered prayers and taken us out of some tough situations. I mean, I read through it and it gives me anxiety. And I think, Lord, thank you. Where would I be without you? Exodus 33, 7 to 11. God spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. I want to end with this verse, because I want to bring it back to the fact that the God we worship is a very personal God. Not the God of naturalism or deism, and he's distant, and a pantheistic God, or a judging God of just monotheism, of regular, a single God religion, but a God of Christianity that is so personable and loving, that desires to have that one-on-one relationship with you, an infinite intelligence, an infinite power, this being that wants to fellowship with you. Folks, I want that to sink in, because that truth changes our prayer life. It changes our lives. It changes our family life. It changes our work life. When we enter into that relationship, man, that's why rebirth happens. That truth sinks in when the Spirit of God lives in us. We call it the Spirit of God. We call God names. We worship Him, and we still don't even understand a fraction of what that God is, what He's like, and He reveals Himself little by little, as much as we can handle. But again, I come to the point that God is so incredible. We are only beginning to understand the meaning of the word love. We compare it to how we love each other, and yet His love for us is infinite, and we don't even know what that means. There is a being out there that loves you, that wants that relationship with you, that sacrificed Himself for you. And I pray, folks, that we walk in that relationship, that relationship transforms us. Amen? Can we stand for prayer? I'll ask the band to come up. I would love to just give us a moment of prayer. I'll take 30 seconds to just share. My grandpa passed away on Saturday. But one thing that I remember about him is some of his prayers. As he's standing in his living room, I was leaving the house, he's like, hey, I want to pray over you. And then he's standing there, and as he's praying to God, I saw in his life that closeness with the Lord, that desire to, hey, I'll see him soon, I'll be with my God soon. When he's standing in his living room, and I remember one of his prayers distinctly, and he's saying, Father, I can't wait to be home soon. I can't wait to go. I can't wait for you to take me. I can't wait to be right there with you. Man, I think Moses had that desire to talk to God face to face. I pray that we have that desire, and our prayer is, Father, I can't wait for you to be manifest, to know you better, to finally have a wider understanding of you and still spend the rest of my existence into eternity gaining more knowledge about you. I can't wait to see you. I can't wait to talk face to face. Can we just bow our hearts? Father, it's so good to be here together with my brothers, sisters, fellow believers, friends that might be here today, and be secure in the knowledge that in a very lost world, we have been called to the truth. That as we look at the evidence, it becomes insurmountable. It continues to point at something greater than us. But not just something greater, something that wants to have a relationship with us, and not a relationship of judgment and punishment, but a relationship of love and trust and forgiveness and faith. And Father, I want to live in that relationship. I know we so often run from it, we doubt it. It affects our prayer life and family life and spiritual life. But Father, you remind us again this morning of who you are, your reality, your love, your sacrifice for us, and call us back into that knowledge of you. And Dad, I just pray we submit. I just pray we submit to this truth and live in it and love it and speak of it to others with confidence, because we worship the true God. We worship the God that exists today, that influences our life. Man, you're right here, right now. Dad, thank you for your blessings. Dad, thank you for your love. We bow before you. We honor you. Amen.